I hadn't been back to that bar in over 20 years. The reunion committee chose it for nostalgia, I think, some misguided belief that the place where we used to sneak fake IDs and nurse watered-down beers would feel like home again. But walking through those doors, I felt nothing like the boy I used to be. The air was thick with the smell of spilled beer and lemon wedges, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes long after you leave. Low music hummed beneath bursts of laughter, voices competing to be heard over the jukebox, playing songs we once knew by heart. I had loosened my tie hours ago. The fabric felt like a noose earlier in the evening, back when I was still pretending to care about who got divorced or who made partner at some law firm downtown. My wedding ring caught the dim bar light as I reached for my glass, and for a moment I studied it. The gold band worn smooth from 2 decades of wear, a symbol of a life I had built with care and intention. Across from me sat Elias. The years had been kind to him in some ways, cruel in others. Gray threaded through his temples now, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we were 17. But that spark was still there, that mischievous glint that used to get us both into trouble. He was telling a story about the time we convinced half the football team that the chemistry lab was haunted, his hands moving in animated gestures, and I found myself laughing in a way I hadn't in months. Maybe years. It felt like being young again, like being whole. We were trading memories like currency. Who dated who? Whose parents caught them sneaking out? The night someone crashed their father's car into Mrs. Henderson's mailbox. The kind of stories that only matter to the people who live them. Time was folding back on itself, collapsing the distance between then and now. And for those few hours, I let myself forget about the mortgage and the parent-teacher conferences and the quiet dinners with my wife, where neither of us had much to say anymore. But then something shifted. I was in the middle of describing the prank we pulled on Principal Matthews when I noticed Elias had stopped laughing. His expression had changed, softened into something I couldn't quite name. His gaze lingered on me, not the casual glance of an old friend, but something deeper, more deliberate. The noise of the bar seemed to fade into static. He leaned forward slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all night, almost swallowed by the music and the chatter around us. He said he didn't want to just remember the old times. He said he wanted to make new ones. With me. The words landed between us like something physical, something I could almost reach out and touch. My chest tightened. Joy and panic and longing all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untie. I felt my hand move to my ring without thinking, my thumb tracing the smooth metal edge. The gesture was automatic, a reflex born from years of reminding myself who I was supposed to be. The bar suddenly felt too small, too warm. The laughter around us too loud, too false. Everything that had felt comfortable moments ago now felt like a threshold I was terrified to cross. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if there were words for what was happening inside me. The way my heart was racing, the way every nerve in my body seemed to be pulling me toward him while my mind screamed at me to stay still, stay safe, stay silent. Elias was still looking at me, waiting. And I realized that this moment, this single suspended moment in a dim bar that smelled like memory and regret, was going to change everything. I could feel it in the way the air had shifted, in the way time seemed to slow and sharpen all at once. I was 44 years old. I had a wife at home, a daughter sleeping in her childhood bedroom, a life that made sense on paper. And sitting across from me was the boy who once knew every secret I never told, asking me to step into a future I had never let myself imagine. I took a breath. The music played on, and I had no idea what I was going to do. I drove home that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel too tight, my knuckles white in the dashboard light. The streets were familiar in the way that 20 years of the same route makes familiar. I could have navigated them blind. Past the elementary school where my daughter learned to read, past the coffee shop where Vanessa and I used to meet on Saturday mornings before the kids were born, past the oak tree that bloomed every spring like clockwork. My town, my life, every inch of it mapped and known. Vanessa was already asleep when I slipped into bed beside her. She had left the lamp on for me, the way she always did. A small kindness that made my chest ache. I lay there in the dark listening to her breathe, steady and even, And I thought about all the ways I had built this life with intention. The house we bought when our son was still in diapers. The promotion to department head at the high school. The careful cultivation of respectability, of belonging, of safety. I am a history teacher. I spend my days explaining the past to teenagers who think history has nothing to do with them. I tell them about revolutions and migrations, about the way people have always been willing to risk everything for freedom, for truth, for love. And then I go home and grade papers at the kitchen table, the same table where we eat dinner every night, where my daughter does her homework while complaining about calculus, where Vanessa pays the bills and plans the grocery runs and reminds me about parent-teacher conferences I have somehow forgotten. The routines are predictable. Morning coffee in matching mugs that Vanessa bought years ago from some catalog. The sound of the lawn mower on Sunday afternoons, cutting the same grass I have cut for 2 decades, the smell of it sharp and green in the summer heat. The annual block party where I stand around grilling hamburgers and talking about property taxes and school board elections with neighbors whose names I know, but whose lives remain distant and unknowable. Our house is full of framed photographs. My son at graduation, cap tilted at an angle, grinning at a future we told him was limitless. My daughter at her dance recital, pink tutu and missing front teeth. Family vacation to the beach, all of us sunburned and happy, or at least appearing happy. The photographs line the hallway like evidence of a life well lived, like proof. But beneath the polished surfaces, I feel hollow. There are cracks I never let anyone see. Nights when I linger too long over an old yearbook, my finger tracing faces from another lifetime. Mornings when I catch myself humming songs from high school, songs that belong to a version of me I buried so deep I convinced myself he never existed. I once told myself this was simply adulthood, the price of stability. Everyone feels this way, I thought. Everyone learns to live with the gap between who they are and who they show the world. Vanessa is a good woman. I need to say that clearly, because what comes next might make it seem otherwise. She is steady and kind and patient in ways I have never deserved. She has held our family together through illnesses and job changes and the 1,000 small disasters that make up a life. She loves me, or at least she loves the version of me I have allowed her to know. And I love her too, in the way you love someone who has walked beside you through decades of ordinary days. But there is a tiredness in her now that I cannot ease. I see it in the way she moves through the house, efficient and distant, as though she is completing tasks rather than living a life. We have not touched each other with real desire in years. Our conversations revolve around logistics. Who is picking up the dry cleaning, whether we need to replace the water heater when the car is due for an oil change. We are partners in the business of living, but somewhere along the way we stopped being lovers. Stopped being friends, even. I wonder sometimes if she knows. If she senses the parts of me I keep locked away. If she lies awake at night feeling the same hollow ache, the same sense that we are both playing roles in a story someone else wrote for us. The high school where I teach sits at the edge of town, brick and functional and unchanged since I was a student there myself. I walk the same hallways I walked as a teenager, teach in the same classrooms where I once daydreamed through lectures. My colleagues respect me. The principal values my reliability, my ability to handle difficult parents and rowdy students with the same calm demeanor. I am good at my job. I care about my students in ways that surprise me sometimes. Their questions, their struggles, the way they are all trying to figure out who they are supposed to become. But there are moments when I stand in front of the classroom talking about the American Revolution or the Civil Rights Movement, and I feel like a fraud. I tell these kids about people who fought for their truth, who risked everything to be seen and heard and acknowledged. And then I go home and continue the careful performance of a life built on silence. I have learned to navigate the unspoken rules of my town, my marriage, my role as father and teacher and neighbor. I know what to say at church picnics and what to avoid at faculty meetings. I know how to smile and nod and keep every dangerous thought locked safely away. I have become an expert at the art of disappearing while remaining visible. And then Elias appeared again, as though time had been waiting for us both. I did not expect to see him at the reunion. I had not thought about him in years, or at least I had trained myself not to think about him. But the moment he walked into that bar, something shifted inside me. A door I had sealed shut cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light, and I realized how long I had been living in darkness. He looked different and exactly the same. The years had carved lines into his face, had silvered his hair at the temples, had added weight to his shoulders in the way that time does to all of us. But his eyes were the same. That spark of mischief, of defiance, of aliveness. He saw me across the room and smiled, and I felt something in my chest that I had not felt in decades. Recognition, not just of him, but of myself. We spent the evening trading stories, laughing at memories that felt both distant and immediate. And I let myself slip back into the skin of the boy I used to be, the one who believed the world was wide and full of possibility, who had not yet learned that some desires are meant to be buried, that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. But now I was home, lying beside my wife, staring at the ceiling in the dark, and I could still feel the weight of Elias's words hanging in the air between us. He did not want to just remember the old times. He wanted to make new ones. With me, I turned my head and looked at Vanessa, her face soft in sleep, and I felt the full weight of what I had built pressing down on me. This house, this marriage, this carefully constructed life, all of it suddenly felt fragile, like a structure built on sand, waiting for the tide to come in and wash it away. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but my mind would not quiet. I kept seeing Elias's face in the dim light of the bar, kept hearing his voice, kept feeling the way my heart had raced when he looked at me with that unbearable honesty. For the first time in my life, I let myself imagine what it might be like to stop pretending, to stop performing, to stop living in the narrow space between who I was and who I had convinced everyone I should be. And the thought terrified me. The message came 3 days later. I was sitting at the kitchen table grading essays on the Industrial Revolution, red pen in hand, when my phone lit up beside me. A text from a number I did not have saved, but I knew immediately who it was. The words were simple, almost casual. Still can't stop laughing about the other night. Want to grab coffee this weekend? I stared at the screen until it dimmed, then lit it again with a touch. My hands were trembling. Vanessa was upstairs getting ready for bed. My daughter was in her room, headphones on, lost in whatever teenage world she inhabited. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of water running through pipes. I knew the sensible answer. I knew what a responsible man, a faithful husband, a good father would do. He would type a polite decline. He would say he was busy, that work was overwhelming, that family obligations made it impossible. He would close that door gently but firmly, and he would go back to grading papers and mowing lawns and living the life he had chosen. But something deeper pulled at me, something that had been sleeping for so long I had forgotten it was there. I typed a response before I could talk myself out of it. Sure, Saturday afternoon. And then I sat there staring at what I had written, my thumb hovering over the send button, my heart pounding in my chest like I was 17 again, making a choice I knew would change everything. I pressed send. We met at a coffee shop on the edge of town, a place I had never been before. I told Vanessa I was meeting an old colleague to discuss curriculum changes. The lie came easily, which frightened me. I had never been a good liar, had never needed to be. But here I was, inventing excuses with the fluency of long practice, as though some part of me had been preparing for this moment all along. Elias was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table by the window with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He smiled when he saw me, that same mischievous warmth, and stood to greet me. We shook hands like old friends, but the contact lasted a beat too long, and I felt heat rise to my face. We talked for 2 hours. About nothing, about everything. He told me about his life after high school, the years he spent in the city trying to make it as a musician, the marriage that ended badly after only 3 years, the way he had moved back to care for his aging mother when her health began to fail. He spoke with a directness I had forgotten existed, a willingness to name pain and disappointment without dressing it up in platitudes. He said the town never quite forgave him for being different, that he had learned to live with being looked at sideways, with conversations that stopped when he entered a room, with the careful distance people maintained. He said it with a kind of resigned acceptance that broke something in me. I found myself talking in ways I had not talked in years. About the hollow feeling that followed me through my days. About the sense that I was watching my own life from a distance, like an actor who had forgotten he was playing a role. About the quiet loneliness of being surrounded by people who loved a version of me that was not quite real. Elias listened without judgment, without offering solutions or comfort. He simply listened, and that was enough. More than enough. When we finally left, standing in the parking lot beside our cars, he asked if I wanted to meet again. I said yes without hesitation. The meetings became regular. Once a week at first, then twice. We cycled through coffee shops and bookstores, walking trails around the lake where we used to skip stones as teenagers. Each encounter felt like stepping through a door into a parallel life, one where I did not have to measure every word, every gesture, every glance. Elias took me to an old record store that somehow still existed, tucked between a dry cleaner and a tax office. The air inside smelled like dust and vinyl and nostalgia. He flipped through albums with the careful attention of someone who believed music mattered, who treated each record like a small piece of history worth preserving. He pulled out an album from the 80s, some band I had loved in high school and forgotten about entirely, and handed it to me with a grin. "You played this so many times your tape deck ate it, remember?" I did remember. The memory arrived complete and vivid, like a photograph suddenly coming into focus. I had listened to that album on repeat the summer before senior year, lying on my bedroom floor, feeling things I had no language for. I looked at Elias and realized he had been part of those feelings, had been woven into them in ways I had spent decades trying to forget. We drove out to the pier one evening, the same pier where we had spent countless afternoons as teenagers. It was quieter now, more run down. The wood was weathered and soft in places, and there were signs warning about structural damage. But we sat at the edge anyway, our legs dangling over the water, watching the sun sink below the horizon. Elias told me about the loneliness of coming back to a hometown that felt like a museum of your past, a place where everyone remembered who you used to be, but no one cared who you had become. He told me about the silence of his mother's house, the way he could hear every creak and groan of the old structure, the way time seemed to move differently there, slower and heavier. I told him about the silence in my marriage, the way Vanessa and I moved around each other like polite strangers, the way I had stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. I told him things I had never said to anyone, secrets I did not even know I was carrying. The conversations stretched into hours. We found a diner that still served the same burnt coffee we used to complain about as kids, and we sat in the back booth talking until the waitress started stacking chairs on tables around us. We talked about our failures and our regrets, about the people we thought we would become and the people we actually were. We talked about everything except the thing that hummed between us, the unspoken pull that grew stronger with each meeting. I began keeping small secrets. I deleted text messages before anyone could see them. I made excuses to leave the house, invented errands that did not exist. I felt the weight of Vanessa's trust like a stone in my chest, but I could not stop. I did not want to stop. Because when I was with Elias, I felt something I had not felt in decades. I felt seen, not as a father or a husband or a teacher, but simply as a man, as Julian, the version of myself I had buried so deep I thought he was gone forever. We were sitting in his car one night after dinner at a restaurant 2 towns over, a place where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. The conversation had gone quiet, the comfortable silence of people who did not need to fill every moment with words. Elias's hand rested on the console between us, and I found myself staring at it, at the familiar shape of his fingers, at the way the streetlight caught the edge of his wrist. He turned to look at me, and the air shifted. I felt my heart begin to race, felt heat spread across my skin. He said my name softly, like a question, and I realized we were closer than we had been a moment before. I could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, could count the lines at the corners of his mouth. I pulled back, suddenly terrified. I said I should get home, that Vanessa would be wondering where I was. Elias nodded, but I could see the hurt in his eyes, the disappointment. I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind a riot of panic and longing. That night, I lay awake beside Vanessa, staring at the ceiling, and I knew I was standing on the edge of something I could not take back. Every meeting with Elias was a step closer to a precipice, and I was terrified of falling, but more terrified of turning back. I was 44 years old. I had spent my entire adult life building a careful structure of safety and respectability. And now that structure was beginning to crack, fault lines spreading through the foundation, and I did not know if I wanted to shore it up or let it collapse entirely. Elias had awakened something in me that I thought was long dead. A hunger for authenticity, for truth, for a life lived without the constant weight of pretending. And I realized with a clarity that made me nauseous that I could not go back to the way things were before. The door had been opened, and no amount of willpower could close it again. I was changing, slowly and irrevocably, and I had no idea how to stop it, or if I even wanted to. The lies became easier. That was what frightened me most. The first few times I invented excuses to see Elias, my voice wavered, my hands shook, guilt written across my face in ways I was certain everyone could see. But as the weeks passed, the deception became smoother, more natural. I told Vanessa I had joined a book club with some teachers from work. I said I was mentoring a struggling student who needed extra help after school. I claimed department meetings that did not exist, professional development seminars that were pure fiction. She believed me, or maybe she chose to believe me. I could not tell which was worse. I began to notice things about myself that had changed. Small things at first. The way I lingered over my reflection in the bathroom mirror each morning, wondering what Elias saw when he looked at me. The way I found myself smiling at random moments throughout the day, remembering something he had said, some observation that made the world feel less heavy. The way music sounded different now, richer and more alive, as though someone had turned up the volume on a frequency I had forgotten existed. My daughter asked me one evening why I seemed happier lately. We were sitting at the dinner table, Vanessa serving chicken and rice, the television murmuring in the background. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, terrified that she could see through me so easily. I told her I was just feeling good about the school year, about my students. She smiled and said she was glad, that I had seemed sad for a long time. The observation cut through me like a blade. Vanessa said nothing, but I caught her watching me sometimes with an expression I could not read. Concern, maybe, or suspicion, or perhaps just the tired resignation of a woman who had stopped expecting anything different from her marriage. Elias and I fell into a rhythm. Thursday evenings became ours, a standing appointment neither of us named, but both of us honored. Sometimes we met at the diner, sometimes at the lake, sometimes we just drove with no destination in mind, the car filled with conversation and silence in equal measure. He took me to places that felt untouched by my other life. A used bookstore on the outskirts of the next town over, the kind of place with narrow aisles and stacks that reached the ceiling and a cat sleeping on the counter. We browsed in comfortable quiet, pulling books from shelves and reading passages aloud to each other. Elias found a collection of poems by a writer I had never heard of, and he read one to me in a low voice. And I felt something shift in my chest, some locked door beginning to open. We went to a hole-in-the-wall restaurant that served food from his mother's country, dishes I could not pronounce, but that filled the air with spices and warmth. He ordered for both of us, speaking to the owner in a language I did not understand, and I watched him come alive in a way I had never seen. He belonged there in a way he did not belong in our hometown, and I realized how much of himself he had learned to hide, just as I had. One evening we drove out to the edge of town where the houses thinned out and the fields opened up under a sky thick with stars. We parked on a dirt road and got out of the car, leaning against the hood in the darkness. Elias pointed out constellations, telling me their names and their stories, myths about gods and heroes and lovers who had been transformed into light. I had not looked at the stars in years. Not really. Living in town with its streetlights and constant glow, the night sky had become something I barely noticed. But out here, away from everything, the universe opened up above us, vast and indifferent and beautiful. I felt small in a way that was comforting rather than terrifying. Elias turned to me and said he used to come out here when he was younger, when the town felt too small and too judgmental and too suffocating. He said he would lie in the bed of his truck and stare at the sky and remind himself that there was more to the world than this place, these people, these expectations. He said it was the only thing that kept him sane some nights. I understood what he meant. I understood it in my bones. We were standing close, our shoulders almost touching, and I became acutely aware of every point where our bodies nearly met. The space between us felt charged, electric. I could feel the heat radiating from him, could hear the rhythm of his breathing. My own breath had gone shallow. He turned his head to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my heart stutter. Want, raw and undisguised. And beneath that, something deeper. Tenderness. The kind of tenderness that terrified me more than desire ever could. I looked away, pretending to study the stars, but my hands were trembling. He reached out and touched my arm, just his fingertips against the fabric of my jacket, but the contact sent electricity through me. He said my name softly, and I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the rush of feeling. I told him we should go. My voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. He pulled his hand back immediately, and I could feel the hurt in the way he stepped away, putting careful distance between us. We drove back to town in silence, and when he dropped me off at my car, I could not bring myself to look at him. I mumbled something about seeing him next week and fled. That night, I could not sleep. I lay beside Vanessa, listening to her breathe, and I felt like I was being torn in half. Part of me wanted to wake her up, to confess everything, to ask for forgiveness or permission or understanding. But another part of me, the part that was growing stronger with each passing day, wanted to protect what I had with Elias, to keep it separate and sacred and untouched by the obligations of my other life. The guilt was constant now, a weight I carried in my chest. But beneath the guilt was something else, something that felt like waking up after a long sleep. I was terrified and alive in equal measure, and I did not know how to reconcile those two states. At school, I went through the motions. I taught my classes, held conferences with parents, graded papers with the same diligence I always had. But my mind was elsewhere. I would be in the middle of a lecture about the French Revolution and suddenly find myself thinking about the way Elias laughed, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the way he looked at me like I was someone worth seeing. My colleague, David, asked me one afternoon if I was feeling all right. We were in the faculty lounge, both of us nursing bad coffee during our planning period. He said I seemed distracted lately, not myself. I forced a smile and told him I was fine, just tired. He nodded but did not look convinced. The next Thursday, I drove to meet Elias with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Part of me wanted to cancel, to put distance between us before things went any further. But I could not bring myself to do it. The thought of not seeing him felt unbearable. We met at the pier again. It had become our place somehow, this weathered structure jutting out over the water, this remnant of our shared past. We sat at the edge like we always did, and for a long time neither of us spoke. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and deep violet, and the water reflected the colors back like a mirror. Elias broke the silence first. He said he was sorry about the other night, about making me uncomfortable. I turned to look at him, startled. I told him he had nothing to apologize for. The words came out before I could stop them, honest and raw. He met my eyes, and I saw the question there. The hope and the fear and the desperate need to know if what he felt was reciprocated. And I realized I could not keep pretending, could not keep hiding behind carefully constructed walls and polite deflections. I told him he did not make me uncomfortable. I told him the truth scared me, that what I felt when I was with him scared me, that I had spent my entire adult life building a life that made sense, that was safe and predictable and acceptable, and that he was threatening all of that simply by existing. He listened without interrupting, his gaze steady and patient. When I finished, he said he understood, that he was not trying to destroy my life, that he would never ask me to do something I was not ready for. But then he said something that broke me. He said he had been in love with me since we were 17 years old, and that meeting me again had made him realize he had never stopped. The words hung in the air between us, impossible to take back. I felt tears sting my eyes, felt my chest constrict with a mixture of joy and grief, so intense I could barely breathe. I wanted to tell him I felt the same way, that I had always felt the same way, even when I convinced myself I did not, even when I buried those feelings so deep I thought they were gone forever, but I could not say the words. Not yet. So instead I reached across the space between us and took his hand. His fingers threaded through mine, warm and solid and real, and we sat there as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the world around us faded into darkness. That touch changed everything. It was not dramatic, not the grand gesture of films or novels. It was simply two hands joined together, but it felt like a promise, like a door opening that could never quite be closed again. When I finally let go and stood to leave, my palms still tingled from the contact. I drove home in a daze, my mind unable to process what had just happened. Elias loved me. He had said it out loud, had given voice to the thing that hummed between us, the truth we had been dancing around for weeks. And I had not denied it, had not pulled away. I had taken his hand, and in that gesture I had acknowledged that the transformation happening inside me was real and irreversible. I was 44 years old, and I was falling in love. Not the comfortable, settled love of long marriages, but the terrifying, all-consuming kind that makes you feel like you are standing on the edge of a cliff with no idea what lies below. I parked in my driveway and sat in the darkness for a long time before going inside. The lights were on in the kitchen, Vanessa moving past the window, and I knew I would have to walk through that door and continue the performance of being the man she thought she married. But something had shifted irrevocably. I could feel it in the way my heart was still racing, in the phantom warmth of Elias's hand in mine, in the certainty that whatever happened next, I could not go back to the way things were. I was changing, slowly, inexorably, like a glacier carving its way through stone. And for the first time in my life, I was not trying to stop it. It happened on a Tuesday night. I had told Vanessa I was attending a faculty dinner, another lie added to the growing collection. Instead, I met Elias at the diner, and we talked for hours over coffee that went cold and food we barely touched. We talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing with the ease of people who no longer needed to perform for each other. When we finally left, the parking lot was nearly empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Elias offered to drive me to my car, which was parked a few blocks away at the school. I climbed into his passenger seat, and we drove through the quiet streets of our town, past darkened storefronts and houses where families were settling in for the night. He parked across the street from my car, the engine idling softly. Neither of us moved to get out. The silence between us felt different this time, weighted with everything we had not yet said, everything we had been carefully avoiding. The dashboard lights cast a soft glow across his face, and I found myself memorizing the details, the line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the vulnerable openness in his eyes. He turned to look at me, and I saw him gathering his courage. He said we needed to talk about what was happening between us, that he could not keep pretending it was just friendship, just two old friends reconnecting. His voice was gentle but firm, and I felt my heart begin to race. I told him I knew, that I had known for weeks, maybe longer, that I was terrified of what it meant. He reached across the console, his hand moving slowly, giving me time to pull away. But I did not pull away. His fingers brushed against mine, tentative and achingly gentle, and then his palms settled over the back of my hand. The touch sent heat through my entire body. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt monumental, like crossing a line I had spent my entire life afraid to approach. He asked me what I wanted. The question hung in the air between us, impossible to answer and impossible to avoid. What did I want? I wanted everything and nothing. I wanted to go back in time and make different choices. I wanted to stay in this car forever, suspended in this moment where anything was still possible. I wanted to run. I wanted to never leave. I looked down at our hands, his fingers now threaded through mine, and I felt something inside me crack open. All the years of silence, of pretending, of carefully constructed distance, all of it crumbling under the weight of this simple touch. I told him I wanted to be honest for once in my life, that I was tired of living behind walls, that when I was with him, I felt like the person I was supposed to be, the person I had spent decades trying to forget. His grip on my hand tightened. He said he had wanted this for so long. That meeting me again had been the first time in years that he felt hope for something more than the quiet loneliness he had learned to accept. He said he thought about me constantly, wondered what I was doing, if I thought about him too, if there was any chance that what he felt was not one-sided. I turned to face him fully, and the distance between us seemed to collapse. We were close now, so close I could see the gold flecks in his eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. He lifted his free hand and touched my face, his fingertips barely grazing my cheek. The gentleness of it undid me completely. I had not been touched like that in so long. Not with tenderness. Not with desire that was wrapped in care. Not with the kind of attention that made me feel seen all the way through. He whispered my name like a question, like a prayer. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of what I was feeling. And then I leaned forward, closing the last few inches between us, and pressed my lips to his. The kiss was trembling and uncertain and perfect. It was decades of restraint finally breaking. It was every longing I had ever buried, every desire I had convinced myself did not exist. His hand cupped my face, and I felt tears slip down my cheeks, hot and unexpected. I was not sure if they were tears of joy or grief, or some mixture of both. We pulled apart after a moment, both of us breathing hard. I opened my eyes to find him looking at me with an expression of such tenderness that it hurt. He wiped the tears from my face with his thumb, his touch achingly gentle. He said he was sorry, that he did not mean to make me cry. I shook my head, unable to find words. I was not sorry. I was terrified and exhilarated and more alive than I had felt in 20 years. I told him this, the words coming out rough and broken, and he smiled, that beautiful, mischievous smile I had loved since we were teenagers. We sat there in the car, holding hands, our foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air. I could feel his heartbeat through his fingertips, could feel the slight tremor in his hands that told me he was just as overwhelmed as I was. He told me he loved me. Said it again, clearer this time, the words deliberate and sure. He said he had loved me for as long as he could remember, and that kissing me felt like coming home after being lost for decades. I wanted to say it back. The words were there, pushing against my throat, demanding to be spoken. But I could not make them come out, because saying them would make this real in a way I was not sure I could handle. It would mean acknowledging that everything I had built, everything I had convinced myself I wanted, was not enough, had never been enough. Instead, I kissed him again, deeper this time, less hesitant. I poured everything I could not say into that kiss, all the longing and fear and desperate need. He responded in kind, his hand moving to the back of my neck, holding me like something precious. When we finally pulled apart, I was shaking. I looked at the clock on the dashboard and realized with a jolt that I had been gone for hours. Vanessa would be wondering where I was. Panic flooded through me, cold and immediate. Elias saw the change in my expression. He pulled back, giving me space, his hand slipping from mine. He told me he understood, that he did not want to make my life harder than it already was. But the hurt in his eyes was unmistakable. I wanted to stay. I wanted to ignore the clock and the obligations waiting for me and the life I had built on careful lies. But I could not. Not yet. So I told him I had to go, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded and looked away. I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, he caught my wrist gently. He said he needed to know if this was real, if what we had just shared meant something, or if I was going to go home and pretend it never happened. The question pierced through me. I looked at him, at the vulnerability written across his face, at the fear that I would disappear back into my other life and leave him alone with the truth we had just spoken into existence. I told him it was real, that I could not pretend it was not, that I did not know what came next, but I could not unfeel what had been awakened. He released my wrist and nodded slowly. He told me to be careful driving home, to text him when I got there safely. Such ordinary words, but they felt like a tether, a promise that this was not ending, that we would see each other again. I got out of the car and walked to my own, my legs unsteady beneath me. I could feel him watching me, could feel the weight of everything that had just changed between us. I climbed into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. When I finally looked up, Elias was still there, his car idling across the street, waiting to make sure I was all right. I lifted my hand in a small wave, and he returned it before pulling away into the night. I drove home with my lips still tingling, with the ghost of his touch still warm on my skin. I could taste him, could feel the imprint of his fingers on the back of my neck. My mind was a riot of sensation and emotion, terror and liberation colliding inside me. For the first time in my life, I knew what it was to be fully alive. And I was completely, utterly terrified of losing everything because of it. When I pulled into my driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light Vanessa always left on. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at that light, knowing that when I walked through that door, I would have to put the mask back on. I would have to be the Julian she knew, the one who had never kissed another person with such desperate longing, who had never felt his entire world shift on its axis. But I also knew that I could never fully go back. The door had been opened, and there was no closing it. I had tasted truth, and everything else would forever taste like ash in comparison. I touched my lips, remembering. And then I took a breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked inside to continue the performance of a life that no longer fit. The days after the kiss were unbearable. I moved through my life like a ghost, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. I taught my classes without knowing what words came out of my mouth. I sat at the dinner table pushing food around my plate while Vanessa talked about her day and my daughter complained about her chemistry teacher. I nodded and made appropriate sounds, but I was not really there. I could not stop thinking about that moment in the car. The way Elias had touched my face, the taste of his lips, the way my entire body had come alive under his hands. I replayed it obsessively, like a film I could not stop watching, even as guilt gnawed at me with increasing intensity. Vanessa noticed. Of course she noticed. She asked me one morning if everything was all right, her hand on my arm as I stood at the kitchen counter staring at nothing. I told her I was fine, just stressed about work. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but it came out smooth and practiced. She studied my face for a moment, and I saw something shift in her eyes. Not suspicion exactly, but a kind of resigned sadness, as though she already knew the answer but was afraid to ask the real question. My daughter was more direct. She asked me at breakfast why I seemed so sad lately. Said I looked like I was carrying the weight of the world. I forced a smile and told her I was just tired. She did not look convinced, but she let it go. Teenagers have their own problems, their own inner worlds that consume them. I was grateful for her distraction, even as I hated myself for being relieved by it. At school, my colleagues remarked on my distance. David cornered me in the hallway between classes and asked if something was going on at home. He said he had known me for 15 years, and he had never seen me like this. I told him everything was fine, that I was just dealing with some personal things. He looked at me with concern and told me if I needed to talk, he was there. I thanked him and walked away before he could see the tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. I did not know how to exist in both worlds anymore. The version of me that belonged to Vanessa and my children and my carefully constructed suburban life felt like a costume I could no longer wear convincingly. But the version of me that belonged to Elias, that had kissed him with such desperate longing, felt too raw and exposed to bring into the light. I texted Elias late one night, lying in bed beside Vanessa while she slept. I told him I needed to see him. He responded immediately, as though he had been waiting. He said to meet him at the pier the next evening. I got there early, parking my car and walking out to the edge where the wood groaned beneath my feet. The water was dark and restless, the wind carrying the smell of rain. I stood there waiting, my hands shoved deep in my pockets, my heart hammering against my ribs. When Elias arrived, he did not say anything at first. He just stood beside me, close enough that I could feel his presence, far enough that we were not touching. We stared out at the water in silence, and I felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on both of us. Finally he spoke. He said he could not keep doing this, that he understood I had a life, a family, obligations that were real and important. But he could not be the secret I kept hidden away, the thing I only acknowledged in darkness. He said he loved me too much to settle for stolen moments and lies. His words cut through me. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was being unfair, that I was doing the best I could. But I knew he was right. I was asking him to accept crumbs while I kept my real life intact. I was asking him to wait in the margins while I continued to perform normalcy for everyone else. I turned to look at him, and I saw tears in his eyes. He said he needed to know if I was ever going to choose him. Choose this. Choose the truth over safety. He said he had already lost so much time living in fear, and he could not waste what was left waiting for me to be brave enough to love him openly. The ultimatum hung between us, stark and unavoidable. I felt panic rise in my throat. I told him I needed time, that I could not just blow up my entire life without thinking it through, that there were people who would be hurt, children who depended on me, a wife who had done nothing wrong. He nodded slowly, but his expression was resolute. He said he understood that it was complicated, but he also said that love was always complicated, and at some point I had to decide what I was willing to risk for the chance to be truly happy. He said he had already made his choice. He was choosing honesty, even if it meant losing me. I felt something break inside me. The thought of losing him was unbearable, but the thought of destroying my family was equally unbearable. I was caught between two impossible choices, each one requiring me to betray someone I loved. He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and warm. He said he did not want to pressure me, but he also could not keep existing in this liminal space. He needed an answer. Not today, maybe not even soon, but eventually. He needed to know if what we had was real enough for me to fight for. I looked down at our joined hands, and I thought about Vanessa, about the life we had built together, the years of shared history, the children we had raised. I thought about how much it would hurt her to learn the truth, how betrayed she would feel, how her whole world would shatter. But I also thought about myself, about the decades I had spent living a half-life, burying my truth so deep I convinced myself it did not exist, about the way I felt when I was with Elias, like I could finally breathe after being underwater for years, about the person I might become if I had the courage to step into authenticity. I told Elias I needed to go home and think, that I could not make a decision like this standing on a pier in the dark. He released my hand and nodded, but I saw the resignation in his eyes. He thought I was choosing safety, choosing to stay in the life I knew rather than risk everything for love. Maybe he was right. Maybe that was exactly what I was doing. I drove home in silence, my mind a cyclone of conflicting thoughts and feelings. I parked in the driveway and sat there in the darkness, staring at my house. The lights were on in the living room. Through the window, I could see Vanessa on the couch, reading a book, her reading glasses perched on her nose. It was such an ordinary scene, so familiar and safe. I thought about what would happen if I told her the truth. The shock and hurt and anger. The questions about how long it had been going on, how much of our life had been a lie. The logistics of separation, divorce, dividing assets, explaining to our children why their father was leaving. The gossip that would spread through town, the judgment from neighbors and colleagues, and everyone who thought they knew me. The weight of it was crushing. But then I thought about spending the rest of my life in this house, in this marriage, continuing to pretend. Growing old beside someone who loved a version of me that was not real. Watching my days blur together in an endless cycle of routine and resignation. Dying without ever having lived honestly. That weight was equally crushing. I went inside and found Vanessa where I had seen her through the window. She looked up when I entered, and something in my face must have alarmed her because she set her book aside immediately. She asked if I was all right. I told her we needed to talk. She went very still, the kind of stillness that comes from bracing for impact. She said okay, her voice barely above a whisper. I sat down across from her, and for a long moment I could not find the words. How do you tell someone that everything they thought they knew was built on silence and half-truths? How do you explain that you have been living a lie not out of malice, but out of fear? I told her I had not been honest with her, that I had not been honest with myself for a very long time. I told her about Elias, about the reunion, about the months of meetings, and the growing realization that I could not keep pretending. She listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each word. When I finished, the silence was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of our daughter's music from upstairs. Finally, Vanessa spoke. She asked me if I loved him. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. I told her the truth. I said yes. I said I thought maybe I always had. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. She said she had known something was wrong, that she had felt me pulling away for years, had watched me become more and more distant, had sensed that I was unhappy in ways she could not fix. She said she had hoped it was just a phase, that we would find our way back to each other eventually. But she also said she was not stupid, that she had suspected for a long time that there was something I was not telling her. She said she had chosen not to ask because she was afraid of the answer. The guilt I felt was overwhelming. I had done this to her. I had built our life on a foundation of lies, and now I was tearing it all down. I told her I was sorry, that she deserved better than this, that she had been a good wife, a good mother, a good person, and none of this was her fault. She wiped her tears and looked at me with an expression I could not read. She said she needed time to process this, that we would need to figure out what came next, how to tell the children, how to separate our lives after 20 years of being intertwined. But then she said something that surprised me. She said she hoped I would be happy, that despite everything, despite the hurt and betrayal, she did not want me to spend the rest of my life living a lie. She said everyone deserved to be loved for who they really were. Her grace in that moment undid me completely. I broke down, sobbing in a way I had not cried since I was a child. She did not comfort me. She simply sat there, her own tears falling silently, and let me grieve for everything we were losing. When I finally collected myself, I told her I would sleep in the guest room, that I would start looking for an apartment, that we would work through the details slowly, carefully, with as much kindness as we could manage. She nodded and stood up, moving toward the stairs with the careful movements of someone in shock. Before she left the room, she turned back to me. She said she had always known, on some level, that I was never fully present, never fully hers. She said she hoped that wherever I was going, whoever I was becoming, I would finally find peace. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the living room of the house we had built together, surrounded by photographs of a life that was already over. The days that followed were a blur of logistics and grief. Vanessa and I moved through the house like careful strangers, coordinating schedules, discussing how to tell our children, making plans for a separation neither of us had ever imagined. She was remarkably calm, almost clinical in her approach. I think it was the only way she could survive it. We told our daughter together, sitting her down in the living room on a Saturday afternoon. She cried and asked questions we could not fully answer. She wanted to know if we still loved each other, if this was her fault, if there was any chance we would stay together. I told her the truth as gently as I could, that sometimes people grow in different directions, that love is complicated, that none of this was her fault. She looked at me with something like betrayal in her eyes, and I knew she understood more than we were saying. Teenagers are perceptive in ways adults forget. She asked if there was someone else. I hesitated, and in that hesitation she had her answer. She left the room without another word. Our son took it differently when we called him at college. Quieter, more resigned. He said he had seen it coming, that he had noticed the distance between us for years. He said he just wanted us both to be okay, whatever that meant. His maturity made me ache. I found an apartment across town, a small one-bedroom that felt temporary and sad. I packed my things slowly, choosing what to take and what to leave behind. Clothes, books, a few photographs. I left most of the furniture, most of the accumulated debris of 20 years. It felt right somehow, to leave with less than I came with. The night before I moved out, I sat at the kitchen table late, unable to sleep. I wrote Vanessa a letter, the words coming slowly and painfully. I thanked her for the years we had shared, for the children we had raised, for her patience and kindness even now, in the face of my betrayal. I apologized for not being honest sooner, for wasting years of her life on a marriage that could never be what she deserved. I told her I hoped she would find happiness, real happiness, with someone who could love her fully and without reservation. I left the letter on the counter beside her morning coffee cup, next to my wedding ring. The gold band sat there gleaming in the early light, a symbol of promises I could no longer keep. I stared at it for a long time, remembering the day she had slipped it onto my finger, the hope and certainty in her eyes. I felt the weight of everything I was destroying. But I also felt, for the first time in decades, the possibility of being whole. I loaded the last box into my car as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The house looked different in that light, like a place from a dream I was waking up from. I stood in the driveway for a moment, taking it all in, saying goodbye to the life I had built on careful lies and quiet desperation. Then I got in my car and drove. I did not go to my new apartment. Not yet. Instead, I drove across town, through streets that were just beginning to wake up, past the school where I taught, past the diner where Elias and I had spent so many hours talking. I drove until I reached his street, and then I parked outside his house. The sun was fully up now, the neighborhood coming alive with the sounds of morning. I sat in my car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, trying to find the courage to do what I had come here to do. I had texted him the night before, told him I had made a choice, that I needed to see him. He had not responded, and I wondered if I had waited too long, if he had already given up on me. But then the porch light flicked on, and the front door opened. Elias stepped outside, wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt, his hair messy from sleep. He stood on the porch looking at my car, uncertainty written across his face. He did not move closer, did not assume he was welcome. He just waited. I sat there for a long moment, my heart pounding, my breath coming short and shallow. Everything I had been, everything I had built, was behind me now. The future was terrifying and unknown, full of judgment and loss and pain I had caused. But sitting in that car, looking at Elias on his porch, I felt something else too. I felt the possibility of authenticity, of living without the constant weight of pretending, of loving someone openly, without shame or secrecy. I took a breath, a real breath, deep and full, the kind I had not taken in years, maybe decades. The air filled my lungs, and I felt it all the way through my body. It felt like the first free breath of my life. I did not get out of the car. Not yet. I needed this moment, this suspended space between one life and another. I needed to sit with what I had done, what I had chosen, what I was walking toward. Elias understood. He did not rush me or call out. He simply stood there, waiting, giving me the time I needed. The morning light caught his face, illuminating the hope and fear and love written there, and I knew that whatever came next, whatever judgment or loss or pain awaited me, I was choosing truth. I was choosing myself. I was choosing him. I put my hand on the door handle. My fingers tightened around it, and I felt the cool metal against my palm. The door opened. The morning air rushed in, crisp and clean and full of promise. And I stepped out into my new life, broken and honest, and, for the first time, free.